Welcome to Building Safety Webinar Series number 6, Hazard Identification. The opinions expressed in this presentation are my own and do not necessarily represent those of IMechE or any other organisation. Building safety is developing very fast and there are quick changes going on in this business. This series of webinars was based on the work of the CSG Working Group 1 under the leadership of the Engineering Council and is a collaborative project between various organisations involved. This is the whole list of webinar series topics. This is number 6, Hazard Identification, and at the bottom is a link which can take you to the other webinars. We also suggest the safety case report process steps. By now, your building should have been registered and your key building information submitted, and in due course you will receive an invitation to submit an application for a building assessment certificate. And one of the items you need to submit as part of that application is the safety case report. So these process steps we suggest as a logical way to work through the process of generating a good safety case report. And hazard identification is the second part of that process. So what is a hazard? So a hazard is a potential source of harm. The Building Safety Act identifies spread of fire and structure failure as the major building safety risks to be considered. And individual buildings may have other significant safety risks. So we need to understand how we get from hazards to risks. So here are some definitions which I think help to make this clear. So a hazard is an activity or a state of something with the potential to cause harm. So a vehicle going down the road is a hazard because it could cause harm if somebody steps out in front of it. In a building environment, normally we think about fire, gas, those are two potential hazards, but also we have to look at structural failure as another kind of hazard. An event is a situation when a hazard gets out of control. So for example, a fire in a flat breaks out and we get fire spread. A threat is a factor which causes the hazard to become out of control. And the risk is the likelihood of an event occurring and causing consequences. And the sort of consequences we're talking about are, first of all, any harm to people. Secondly, any damage to the building. And there could be other consequences. There could be environmental consequences, for example. An issue is an event already in progress. A barrier is a control which may be designed to prevent a hazard from getting out of control, or to mitigate the consequences of an event if it does happen. And sometimes those are called risk reduction measures. So here's an example. A hazard in a block of flats, as an example, is a fire in an individual flat. An event would be, for example, if the fire spread out of that flat to common areas and other flats. And a threat, for example, is when compartmentation is breached. So, for example, if the door of the flat didn't keep the fire under control for a sufficient period of time for the fire service to get there, that would be a potential threat. Compartmentation is an example of a barrier. So when it's breached, obviously the barrier is breached. The Building Safety Act, as said, limits the safety incidents to be considered in the preparation of the safety case report to those two things, the spread of fire and structural failure. They do reserve the right to prescribe other matters, but at this current time, those haven't been prescribed. I want to mention HAZOP because this comes up in conversation. HAZID, hazard identification, is a technique which is commonly used to identify potential hazards and threats in a process operation. It's very commonly used in the petrochemical industry and so on. And in the process operations, they also use a second process, which is called HAZOP, which is hazard and operability study. And that looks in further detail at the process to see whether the conclusions of the HAZID are valid. So for building safety, government guidance suggests that HAZID is carried out for the identification of potential hazards and threats in a higher risk building. And there's a reference there to government guidance. So we're not suggesting that a HAZOP should be carried out. What we're suggesting is a HAZID, which is hazard identification, followed by the logical steps of prevention and mitigation analysis, root cause analysis, and risk analysis. And those together are rather similar to a HAZOP, but in the context of an occupied building. So this is our suggested hazard identification process. So number one is prepare the terms of reference, and we'll go through all these in detail in a moment. Select the facilitator and recorder, map out the worksheet for recording, initiate the working group, run the meeting, identify the hazards and threats in your building, and record the results. And when you've done that, you then move on to the next step, which is prevention and mitigation analysis, for example, bow tie analysis. So the terms of reference are important because they set up the framework for the HAZID meeting. So you have to set the objective, what are we trying to achieve? The scope is very important. So we need to be clear about the building being studied. The boundaries of the review, for example, whether potential hazards from neighbouring buildings or other facilities are included. The type of hazards to be considered, what barriers exist and potential consequences. And we also need to look at the operational modes to be considered. So the building may be partially occupied, fully occupied, there may be a refurb going on, and sometimes during a refurb, the building is still occupied. So for all these refurb and partial occupation, for example, building work is as defined in the building regulations. So before you start, it's advisable to have a facilitator and a recorder. Facilitator is somebody who can, if you like, manage the meeting and make sure that everybody gets a fair hearing. And the recorder is an important person who will write down, obviously, a recording of what happens in the meeting. Now, government guidance said these two people should have risk assessment and management expertise with the experience of HAZID. But at this point in time, there's very few people with experience of HAZID in a building. But we may find people who have experience of HAZID and HAZOP in the process industries who can, as it were, lend a hand in this first stage of getting all these buildings regulated. As time goes on, more and more buildings will have been studied and will become people with experience of HAZID. So facilitator selection is an important thing. How do you select a suitable candidate? Of course, an ideal thing is if somebody else has been through this process already and can refer you to a facilitator they've used who they're happy with. Somebody with experience of facilitating this type of workshop is really necessary, and somebody with complementary skills to your team. So if you have a team which is well covers the subject, then might be somebody who has particularly good skills in team development, for example, analyzing situations. They might be good at system analysis. You need somebody who listens. We don't want to hear the facilitator's opinion of everything. We want him to listen and guide. And we also need somebody with recognized skills. If they have some sort of qualification, that's really a useful thing. So mapping out a HAZID worksheet before you start going around the building is important. And I suggest that it's good to have some sort of layout like this to begin with, and then discuss it with the meeting. You want the meeting participants to support the kind of form you're going to record on and not go off thinking, well, this is not very good. So you might want to change this form during the meeting and get it agreed by everybody. So the structure of the HAZID team. We need people with a mix of skills, and teams usually work best with not more than about 6 people. So these need to be people who have complementary skills, really. So somebody with a good knowledge of the details of the building being assessed would be good. How it was constructed and any subsequent refurbishments. Somebody with a resident profile of the building and knows about a particular type of people we have living there. That should be fire safety, structural safety, the use of other parts of a mixed-use building, such as retail or offices. It's important to know. And maintenance regimes of the building, safety management system being used for the building, and useful to have an overview of the maintenance regimes and safety management systems of other accountable persons where the building has more than one AP. So running the meeting, for each session, the team should be introduced to the parts of the building being assessed, and the team should be provided with a description of the part of the building being assessed, including plans, resident profile, and its accountable persons. So those are things which you need to know. And the facilitator should encourage the team to ask questions to identify how building safety risks might occur, how they develop, and what consequences could be. And then the recorder, with the support of the facilitator, is going to write all that down. So the suggested process is divide the building into areas for assessment. Do this before the hazard study starts or as part of the first session to encourage full ownership of the process. How you divide the building up will depend on the individual building, but it might be by control if you've got multiple accountable persons. It might be by blocks if the building's been designed like that, into floors, grouping perhaps identical floors for consideration together. By functions, so dwellings or utility type rooms. A combination with regard to any unusual or unique features. So the study team needs to consider any interaction between functions or areas. So running the meeting, review the key building data, look at the building plans, visit all parts of the building as discussed, including the outside of the building, so looking for access for firefighting teams that are going to come, the roof where you may have smoke ventilation facilities there, vacant flats, if possible, visit some vacant flats and get a good idea of the inside of the flat. And don't forget, just walking through a building is only a walkthrough. You've got to be walking through, looking for potential problems, and then recording. So this guide I've pointed to here, this signpost, is to a HAZOP guide, but in fact, the first part of that guide is very useful for understanding how a HAZID meeting should run. That guide is in many editions, and you don't need the latest edition, which is quite expensive. You can find earlier editions available for a very low cost on the internet. So hazards associated with the spread of fire, these are just some examples that you might like to think about. Obviously fire in a flat, but also fire in a common area, Fire might occur in a non-residential unit in the same building. It could be an electrical fire. You may have a transformer station in your building. Electrical fire could occur there also. Fire from a battery has become a particularly difficult problem in recent times. Those are batteries off electrically driven bicycles, for example, and people tend to bring these indoors to recharge them, but you must be very careful and do that under supervised conditions. Don't go to sleep leaving a bicycle battery charging, very dangerous. And people have lost their lives through that process. Inflammable materials in the building, there shouldn't be, but there might be. Gas explosions, of course. And depending on the location of the building, there may be external hazards which should be considered. I put that another reference there to environmental hazards. This is really about floods, earthquakes, this kind of hazard. It just depends where your building is. Obviously, in the UK, we don't get many serious earthquakes, and we certainly don't have any volcanoes. But we do have flooding. It's becoming a more and more serious risk, and that needs to be considered. Structural failure is a more complex problem to consider. The building itself is the hazard or part of the building which might fall down and cause considerable damage to people through just the weight of the building. And the risk may have been increased by the nature of the design or change in the conditions under which the building is operated. So this is not the same thing as a residential building, but as an analogy, car parks, for example, have become much more risky because the weight of cars has increased significantly. So if your building was designed for one particular purpose and the nature of the use of the building has changed, that might increase the risk. Simply the age of the building may have caused the structure to become somewhat risky. So regular building condition monitoring will reveal threats, i.e. unsafe conditions or indications that unsafe conditions may be present and need further investigation. So in webinar number 8, root cause analysis, we look in some more depth at these problems. A useful place to look for information is the CROSS safety website. CROSS is a voluntary organisation supported by some different engineering societies, but they do some very useful reports. This is an older report on their website considering structural design, and basically they suggest that HAZID or an assay, a HAZOP, should be carried out. So thank you very much for listening to this webinar. If you do need to contact me, there is my email contact. I hope it's useful and forms a helpful part of your process. Thank you very much for listening.